Around 4:45 p.m. on February 11th, 1995, a 50-year-old man named Eric Tollett sat in his office in the furniture factory that he owned in Northumberland, which is a pretty rural country in northern England. From inside his office, all Eric could hear outside was the thumping of the rain on the roof. There was this low-pressure system in the area which was causing a really intense thunderstorm. In fact, the storm was so bad that Eric had actually decided to close the factory for the day so all his employees could stay home during the storm. And Eric was glad that he could actually afford to give his employees a day off like this, because it had not always been that way. He had bought this factory 16 years earlier, and it had taken all of his savings and scrapping together all of his money to actually make the investment. And then after he purchased the factory, it required a huge renovation to make it ready to be a furniture factory that he could actually sell products out of. But now, after 16 years of hard work, his business was quite successful. And so a day like today was no big deal. He wasn't all that concerned about the lost profits that day. Instead, he was just using the time to catch up on some admin work and also spend some time with his family. Eric's girlfriend, whose name was Leslie, was at the factory with him, hanging out in the office as well. And also Eric's brother, whose name was Donald, had taken Leslie's 8-year-old son over to the factory's attached garage to go play. But as Eric, shuffled through his paperwork and did a few things, and Leslie was over at the window looking outside, suddenly the door to his office swung open. And it was Leslie's 8-year-old son who came barging in. There's no Donald, so Eric's brother's not with him. And the son, he just looked totally panicked. And he immediately said, before, Eric or Leslie could ask any questions, that Donald had collapsed over in the attached garage. Now, initially, Eric didn't really know what to make of this, but his first thought was, his brother Donald was 60 and he did have some health issues. And just hearing this kid say that Donald had collapsed, it signaled to Eric, like, oh my goodness, did Donald have a heart attack? Or he was also thinking, this kid's only 8 years old. Is he overreacting? Is there actually something totally benign happening? Whatever it was, Eric knew immediately that it was time to drop everything and run over there and check on Donald. And so that's what he did. He and Leslie put their stuff down. They ran with the 8-year-old, through all the way to this attached garage, which, in virtue of it being attached, they never actually went outside into the storm. They just ran straight to this garage. And sure enough, when they got there was Donald laying on the ground. And so before Eric ran over to his brother to assess him, to see what was going on, he just stopped right in the doorway and turned to Leslie and her son, and he told them, go back to my office and call 911. I'll be in there as soon as I can. And so they turned, they left, and then Eric, he turned back around, rushed into the garage, and knelt down next to Donald. And right away, he could tell that his brother was not breathing, and as he's sort of feeling around for some sign of life, suddenly Eric began to feel this incredible tightness in his chest. And then before he knew it, he had blacked out and collapsed right next to his brother. So before Eric purchased this factory 16 years earlier, it had been a factory, but it was not a furniture factory. It was a coal factory. And in virtue of that, there was a coal mine that literally was attached to the structure. Basically, the coal would come up out of the mine and be processed inside of this, big warehouse. Now, when Eric bought it, he knew that there was this coal mine and there was this entrance to the coal mine connected to the structure. But the coal mine was not in use. The entrance to the coal mine had been completely boarded up, and it really played no role whatsoever. However, over the decade and a half that he owned this property and didn't think at all about that coal mine, well, over that time, this poisonous gas called choke damp began to develop inside the mine. And then on the day that, Eric and Donald collapsed inside the garage, well, it was because the low pressure storm outside caused those poisonous gases to rise up and seep out of the boarded up entrance. And those poisonous choke damp gases built up inside of that attached garage, basically making that entire room lethal to anybody inside of there. And so unfortunately, Donald would die from poisoning. Eric, when he passed out, he nearly died, but he was pulled out in time and ultimately woke up in the hospital, and he would survive. At 10 a.m. on September 10th, 2022, A 68-year-old woman named Diana Stewart stood on the deck of a small boat in the Pacific Ocean, less than a mile off the eastern coast of New Zealand. She looked out at the perfectly calm, light blue water, and she saw this albatross bird flying across the sky, so she lifted up her camera and took a picture. Diana was a wildlife photographer, and she was also a member of the Nature Photography Society of New Zealand. And she, along with 9 other members of this society, had chartered this boat for a special birdwatching and photography trip. And so far, the trip had lived up to the hype. They'd spent 2 hours sailing around the water, photographing all these beautiful and rare birds and other wildlife, and they'd even been lucky enough to see a couple of whales. And so this had been really a fantastic trip. Now, at this point, the group had basically finished up their trip, and they were making their way back towards shore. And so as they were going, Diana was keeping her eye out for any last-minute picture opportunities. And as she was looking around, looking for birds, she noticed something in the water. There was something huge moving sort of near the boat. It actually looked like it was moving towards the boat, sort of at an angle. And at first, she couldn't really tell what it was, but then suddenly it came into focus that it was an enormous whale. This huge whale is going to swim basically right under the boat. And so Diana, she pulled out her camera to take a photo, but then the worst thing possible happened. This whale, sure enough, came towards the boat, but it didn't go under the boat. It rammed the side of the boat. And before Diana could do anything, suddenly the boat was lurching onto its side, and she and the rest of the crew were thrown off the boat into the frigid water. And the second she hit the freezing cold water, her life jacket, which she was wearing, it automatically inflated. It was one of those auto-inflate life jackets. It inflates, and she's sort of disoriented. The water was so shockingly cold. I mean, this is a completely unbelievable situation to find yourself in. But, as she surfaced and she tried to get her bearings, she realized it was pitch black everywhere she looked, and it was so loud. She could barely hear anything but the sound of the engine of the boat. And that's when she realized, as she's putting her hands up, that the boat must have capsized and landed on top of her. But there's this little bit of air. She's basically in an air pocket, but she can't hear anything. She just hears the sound of this engine, and it's deafening. And so she began calling out for help, and she tried to kind of maneuver out from underneath, this curved underside of the boat that created this pocket. But she couldn't find her way out. And this life jacket she had on was fully inflated. She couldn't, deflate it. And because of her buoyancy, she couldn't swim down below and get out from under this boat. And so she's sort of trapped underneath this boat. It's freezing cold. The water could easily give you hypothermia in less than 30 minutes. It's total chaos. It's loud because of the engine. And so Diana's trying not to panic. And as she's sort of looking around, fumbling in the dark, gasping for air, she realized there were other people also trapped underneath. And so she's grabbing at them and trying to talk to them, and they're all panicked. She has no idea, what their state is. Are they hurt? She doesn't know. And so basically her only option at this point was just to bang on the underside of this boat, just trying to get anybody's attention outside, out from underneath where they were, to know that they were trapped under here. They needed help. And in fact, when she began knocking, there were people outside the boat, basically, who had been thrown off the boat. Everybody had been thrown off the boat. There was 11 people. 6 people were not trapped under the boat. 5, including Diana, were trapped underneath. And so as Diana is pounding the underside of the boat, the skipper of the boat, a guy named Mark, he was one of the 6 who were outside, and he clearly heard the knocking sound. And so he's obviously in a bad situation too, same as everybody else in the water. But he was in a markedly better situation because he's not trapped under this boat. And so he quickly understood that, okay, he needs to gather the 6 people he's with, kind of make sure they're okay, and then figure out how they're going to get these people trapped under the boat out. And so his first instinct was just to bang back on the side of the boat, to let them know, hey, we hear you. But again, you got to picture the scene. They are suddenly in the water because a whale flipped their boat. They have no idea if this boat's going to sink any second here. The engine is currently running, so it's super loud. The water is freezing cold. They're out in the middle of the ocean. Like, this is a true life or death situation here. But Mark, he does his best to stay calm. He's hitting the boat back to let the folks know down underneath the boat that they're okay. We'll get you out of there. But underneath, Diana and the others, they're starting to panic. It's hard to breathe down there. I mean, there's really not much air. The water's choppy because they're moving around. And so they're gulping down water as they're doing their best to survive down there. But they just keep hitting the boat back saying, come on, you got to get us out of here. But periodically, they'd still try to force themselves out from underneath. But again, their life jacket just made it impossible. Like they didn't have a way out unless they ditched their life jacket. But then that's another problem. Like, are you really prepared to ditch your life jacket? You don't know if there's obstacles when you swim out from under. You don't know if you're even strong enough to make the swim. What happens if you get stuck down below? Like there's all these factors that sort of forced the group under the boat to do nothing and wait and just bang the underside of the boat. And so Mark, out on the outside with his group of 6 people, including himself, they actually climbed on top of the flipped upside down boat. The boat was big enough that he knew their extra weight would not cause it to sink any further or create a worse problem for those under the water. He just knew he had to get those people out of the water to avoid hypothermia. And then once they were all up there, Mark found one of the people he was with, their cell phone, despite being submerged, was still working. And so Mark took the phone, he called authorities and said, you got to send somebody out here right now. We have people trapped in the water. We need your help. Authorities said they would be out there as soon as possible. And sure enough, authorities were able to get out to the boat fairly quickly. And they were able to get Mark and the 5 others that were trapped on top of the capsized vessel to safety. And then divers were sent into the water and they went underneath the boat. And sure enough, the 5 others, Diana included, they were all still there. But unfortunately, all 5 were deceased. However, those 5 didn't die from hypothermia. They didn't die from drowning. When the boat was actually hit by the whale and capsized, it caused some of the gasoline lines to rupture. And so there was this leak in the gasoline lines. And when the boat was upside down, that leak was basically pouring into the air pocket. The dark, freezing cold, loud, awful air pocket they were in was basically filling with toxic gasoline fumes. And ultimately, 17 minutes after capsizing, all 5 died from gasoline poisoning. On Sunday, November 6th, 2022, a 21-year-old man named Yevgeny Titov walked out of his home in a small city called Zhigulovsk, which is in western Russia. Yevgeny got into his car, and then he drove about an hour and a half north to this parking lot where he parked, and then he got out and walked a few blocks to a nearby train station. When he got there, he asked the person behind the counter when the next train was going to St. Petersburg, and they told him there was one leaving soon. He bought a ticket, and then Yevgeny sat and he waited, and then eventually his train rolled through. He climbed on board, took his seat, and for the next 43 hours, because St. Petersburg was 1,000 miles away, Yevgeny just sat there, basically doing nothing for nearly 2 days. He didn't bring anything with him. He had his wallet. That was it. He just sat there, just waiting to get to St. Petersburg. When they got to St. Petersburg, late on the night of Tuesday, November 8th, Yevgeny, calm as can be, stood up, left the train, and then somehow, possibly by another train or by bus or on foot, or maybe somebody gave him a ride, we don't really know, but he traveled about 15 miles south of that train station to Pulkovo Airport in St. Petersburg. But when he got to the airport, he didn't, board a plane like one would do at an airport. Instead, he found his way to this one very specific parking lot that was outside of the airport. Several hours later, in the early morning hours of Wednesday, November 9th, a random person was on their way through that same parking lot on the way to the airport when they started to hear something. It actually sounded like muffled screaming. And at first, they sort of chalked it up to, lots of people making their way to the airport. Maybe it's a kid, maybe it's, someone goofing around. Like, it didn't seem serious. But as they walked towards this open manhole cover, they realized that the screaming they were hearing was actually coming from inside of this hole in the ground. The screams were from Yevgeny, for reasons that we still do not fully understand. Yevgeny, after taking the manhole cover off, climbed down into this manhole, so he goes deep underground, and then when he reached the bottom of the manhole, which was, relatively wide all the way around, you could stand inside of it, there were these different offshoots of pipes that basically traveled underground. And Yevgeny got down and chose one of these pipes that was only a foot in diameter wide. It's like this pitch black, never-ending seeming tunnel. And head first, he began crawling in this tunnel. And he crawled nearly 40 feet before he finally just couldn't move any further. Keep in mind, every inch he was taking, he's basically wedging himself deeper and deeper into this pipe. It isn't like it was big and then got narrow. No, it's this narrow pipe that he forced himself through until he just could not move any farther. And it was at that point, in the wee hours of Wednesday, November 9th, that Yevgeny began to scream. And that's when the person found him. And authorities would go down inside the manhole, and somehow or another, after many hours and all the specialized equipment, they actually would, somewhat unbelievably, pull Yevgeny out of the pipe, and he would survive. Yevgeny would have to actually be hospitalized because he sustained very severe skin damage from basically thrusting himself deeper and deeper into this rusty, awful pipe. He also sustained gas poisoning and hypothermia, but again, he did live. Following this ordeal, authorities would launch an investigation into what exactly happened here, because there was no clear reason why Yevgeny would have traveled all this way to go into this pipe. But when they spoke to Yevgeny after he made his recovery, after he was back to normal, he would just say he has absolutely no memory of doing any of it. On the evening of December 27th, 1984, a 16-year-old boy named John Boulware sat in the passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep as they drove down a residential road in St. Paul, Minnesota. John's best friend was driving, and two more of their friends from school were in the back seat. They were all talking and laughing and singing along to the radio. It was dark outside and it was rainy and kind of an awful night, but John didn't care. He was way too excited because that night, he and his buddies were on their way to see the megastar musician Prince perform live. So Prince was obviously a massive, massive star at the time, and anyone at the time would have been pretty excited to go see him perform live. But this was a particularly big deal for John and his friends because Prince was actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was just 20 minutes away from St. Paul where they were from. So it was kind of like they were going to see their hometown hero. Now, John and his friends didn't expect to become, huge rock star gods like Prince. But there was just something about seeing, this hometown guy achieve his dreams on an international scale. It was just really inspiring. And so again, John and his friends are just so stoked about this concert, like they can't wait to get there. And so John, with all this excitement, he turns around to talk to his friends in the backseat about this concert and how great it's going to be. But right as he turns around, he hears a loud screeching sound and he whips his head back around just in time to see the headlights of the car aimed at this tree that they're careening straight towards. He screams, he hears his friends screaming, they smash into the tree, and everything goes dark. A few minutes later, a St. Paul police officer named Brian Coyle and his patrol partner pulled up behind the now wrecked Jeep. They'd been on their regular patrol when they'd gotten a call about the car crash. Now, the call hadn't come from anybody in the crash, so they really didn't know what to expect. Now, when Coyle stepped out of his own car and walked towards the wreck, it was raining and dark out and, the visibility wasn't great, but right away he saw there were three teenagers who were standing upright outside of the car. Now, they looked pretty shaken up and they visibly had some cuts on their body, but overall, his assessment was they were basically okay. And so while Coyle's partner went to go examine the wreck itself, Coyle walked up to these teenagers. And one of them, through tears, explained to Coyle that he had been driving, and he said he had been just going too fast, and he tried to take a sharp turn, and he hydroplaned, lost control, and they hit the tree. And then the driver said, it didn't matter though how this happened, because what mattered now is his friend, John, is still in the car, and he's not moving. And so Officer Coyle left the teenagers and told them to stay put, and he walked over to the wreck where his partner was, and Coyle, he knelt down and he looked inside the Jeep, and he saw the other teenager, John, slumped over inside the passenger seat, and he wasn't moving. And so Coyle asked his partner, hey, have you checked him? Is he okay? And the partner looked at Coyle and just said, no, he's dead. And so Officer Coyle took a deep breath, and while his partner called for backup and taped off the scene, Coyle went back to John's friends and broke the news as gently as he could. but of course they were all devastated. The only thing Coyle could do to help them was to call an ambulance to come and take them to the hospital to get checked out. Once the ambulance had taken them away, and once John's body had been removed from the Jeep, Officer Coyle and his partner began to document the scene by taking photos of the crashed car with a camera. Now, this was all standard practice, and so while they did it, they didn't think anything of it. However, about a week later, when Coyle and his partner were reviewing the photos they took, Coyle noticed something shocking. One of the pictures that Officer Coyle had taken was so bizarre that it ended up in newspapers, not only in Minnesota, but all over the country. Even today, 30 plus years later, people are still talking about it. And when you see this photo, you'll understand why. This is the photograph. And if you look at the top right, above the Jeep's open door, you'll see something that could just be a flash of light, but to Officer Coyle and to so many others who have looked at this photograph, they say that weird apparition-looking thing above the Jeep looks eerily similar to John Boulware's face, the 16-year-old victim of the car crash. And it almost looks like this photograph captured like the moment of John's spirit departing Earth, like it's showing his final moment in life, like when he died, screaming as the car is about to crash into this tree. One evening in the summer of 1974, a 60-year-old doctor named Julian Kirchick sat beside his backyard pool at his home in Old Westbury, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. It was a quiet, sunny day, and Dr. Kirchick was glad to have some time to relax. He was a surgeon at a local hospital, and he also had a wife and 4 children, so it was not often that he got a moment of peace to himself. And so Dr. Kirchick leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes and tried to relax for a second, when all of a sudden he heard something rustle in the bushes nearby. Now, at first, he just figured it must be a squirrel or a bird or something, so he didn't even bother opening his eyes, like, this is just nature, it's fine. But this rustling sound persisted, and it just wouldn't stop. And so eventually, Dr. Kirchick did open his eyes, and he got up out of his chair to go see what was going on. Now, these bushes were like 20 feet away from the doctor, and so in order to truly investigate, he had to get up and actually walk over there. And so he gets up and he takes a few steps when he suddenly freezes. Because now, when he's looking at the bushes, he sees there is someone standing basically in the bushes, a person. But he realized this person was not a normal-looking person. The person was wearing what appeared to be this dark, long robe that covered their whole body. And in fact, the robe kind of obscured their face. It was like they were this dark presence just standing there in the middle of these bushes. And so Dr. Kirchick is just frozen, having no idea how to react to this. I mean, does he call out for help? Does he, chase this guy out of his yard? Like, what does he do here? And as he's standing there transfixed, this person in the robe extends one of their arms, this long, skinny arm, and kind of begins to beckon Dr. Kirchick towards them. And Dr. Kirchick went from being sort of startled to being terrified. This figure basically looked like the Grim Reaper. And it felt like now the Grim Reaper is beckoning him to come with him, to come die, basically. That was the feeling he suddenly had. And it was unbelievably overwhelming. And so Dr. Kirchick is staring, horrified. He blinks for a second, and the man is gone. Over the next few days, Dr. Kirchick obsessed over what he had just seen. I mean, really, it felt like he had just witnessed the Grim Reaper, and worse, that the Grim Reaper was like telling him to come with him. Like he was signaling to Dr. Kirchick that his time on Earth had come to an end, that his death was imminent. That's what Dr. Kirchick is thinking. But Dr. Kirchick, he's a surgeon. He's a man of science and reason, and he can't understand how this could have happened. I mean, even if it was just a hallucination, it was so vivid. It was so visceral. Like, how could this be? What's going on with him? But the problem Dr. Kirchick had was, who's he going to talk to about this? Hey, by the way, I saw the Grim Reaper, and now I'm worried I'm going to die soon, or maybe somebody in my family is going to die soon, or a patient is going to die soon. Like, who's going to have that conversation with him? But at the same time that he was feeling increasingly isolated because of this, whatever he saw, he couldn't help but feel like it was real, and it was driving him mad. Like, I'm not doing anything, and something bad is imminent. What do I do? And so for months, Dr. Kirchick just carried this incredible weight with him everywhere he went, like this constant sense of unease, until October of 1974. That month, Dr. Kirchik suddenly got sick. He had a fever, and it just wouldn't go away. And so he went to his own doctor for a checkup, and his doctor told him, "I got some bad news." That day, Dr. Kirchik was diagnosed with an incurable form of blood cancer. He was heartbroken, but he was not totally surprised, because for him, this sort of felt like a validation of what he'd already seen. Death, the Grim Reaper, had been calling him, and now Dr. Kirchik knew why. Dr. Kirchik would share his story with newspapers, which is how we know about it today. And shortly after sharing his story, Dr. Kirchik would die. Hey guys, I have a really cool announcement for you. So right now, if you head over to shopmrballin.com, you will find brand new limited time merch items on our site. We have the brand new signature Mr. Ballin hat. Okay, you gotta wear that backwards, of course. There's the black version, and also we have the white mesh version as well. Very cool. It's the thumbs up logo. Very nice, cool hat. And then of course, we also have this nifty new flannel color, okay? Yellow. Really fits the vibe of the fall season. Okay, get yourself one of these. But remember, these are limited time items just for the fall, so get them while you can. Again, that is shopmrballin.com. You got the new flannel, the multiple versions of the hat that you gotta wear backwards. Go check it out. Again, shopmrballin.com. Thank you. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 27th, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leniger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and his wife and his 2-year-old son James had just gotten home from church, and now Bruce was just trying to relax. However, it was proving very difficult to relax because as Bruce is trying to sit on the couch and just kind of close his eyes for a second, his son, James, the 2-year-old, has his toy plane, his favorite toy plane, and he is repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he can, saying, "Plane crash, plane crash, plane crash." And while, of course, James is a kid, he's gonna be loud and noisy and obnoxious, that's what kids do. But for Bruce, he's watching his son do this, and he couldn't help but be really concerned. Because lately, over the past few months, James had become unnaturally fixated, not on planes, but on plane crashes. And even more specifically, James had begun having these recurring nightmares, 4 or 5 times a week, where he'd wake up terrified and he would say he, James, had just been in a horrible fiery plane crash. And it was every night. That was the nightmare. And it was Bruce and his wife didn't even know what to make of this. Where's he getting this from? James was a pretty sheltered kid. He wasn't being exposed to, horrible plane crashes, either in movies or TV shows or books. He's a 2-year-old. It just made no sense that he was having this recurring nightmare. But what made it even more kind of unsettling is that James wasn't just fixated on the plane crash aspect of this nightmare. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife these weird details about the plane crash, because it was always the same plane crash in his nightmare. He began telling his parents that the Japanese shot me down. And Bruce and his wife are like, what is he referencing? Is this a World War II reference? But again, he's 2. Developmentally, it's not something he would say even if he was exposed to it. It just didn't make any sense. Now, over the past few months that this behavior had really ramped up, Bruce and his wife had taken James to the doctor to say, what's going on here? What's my kid doing? I don't understand any of this. And the doctors were all like, he's a kid. Yeah, it's a weird fixation he's got, but he'll grow out of it. Don't worry about it. But to Bruce and his wife, it just seemed like James was not growing out of it. He was just getting more and more fixated as time went on. And so as Bruce is sitting there on the couch watching James for the millionth time smash his toy plane into the coffee table and pretend it was this plane crash he couldn't stop thinking about, Bruce decided he had to do something about this. And so over the next couple of months, Bruce, instead of trying to figure out what was wrong with James that was causing him to fixate on this plane crash, instead of doing that, he began sort of leaning in and asking James to give him more information about whatever he was seeing in his nightmare. Give me all the specifics you can possibly recall. And James would eventually let on that it wasn't just the Japanese that shot him down, it was the Japanese military. And also the type of plane that James was flying in, apparently, was a Corsair plane. Bruce had never heard of that before, and again, he's looking at his 2-year-old son, thinking, how do you even know what a Corsair plane is? But nonetheless, that's what James said. And so Bruce doesn't know what to do with this information, but again, he's just trying to learn. And so in November of that year, Bruce found himself sitting in the living room, and he had this World War II coffee table book that he had actually purchased for his father, but he hadn't given it to him yet. And he saw James, playing with his plane, smashing it into the coffee table. And Bruce, he grabs this coffee table book full of pictures of pilots and combat and war, and he flips to pictures of pilots from World War II. Because now, Bruce is thinking, maybe my son somehow is imagining a scene from World War II. A pilot has crashed in World War II, the Japanese military shot them down, I don't know. No idea how he got this image, but that could be what he's thinking about. And so he's like, well, maybe I'll just start looking at pictures from World War II of pilots, and maybe somehow or another James will look at this and something will click for him. Bruce really didn't know what he was trying to get out of this, but either way, he called James over and he shows him this book. And he's like, James, do you recognize any of these planes? Are any of these planes the Corsair plane that you flew, in your dream? Is any of this stuff sort of lining up with your dream? Again, he's talking to a 2-year-old, but the 2-year-old sort of got it. James looked at the pages, but nothing clicked. James sort of reached down and was just kind of flipping through all the pages, and there was nothing. There was no connection with James. But towards the end of the coffee table book, where Bruce is thinking, what am I even doing here? I'm prompting my 2-year-old to research World War II with me. What is this? What is going on here? But as James is flipping the pages, he suddenly stops. And he points at one of the pages, and he says to his dad, that's where I was shot down. And he's pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so Bruce, again, he doesn't really know what he's trying to accomplish here, but, clearly his son has pointed out this particular fact that's sort of roughly tied in with the other things he's brought up. He's had this dream about being a pilot who crashes because the Japanese military shot him down. He's highlighting a battle in Japan during World War II where, the Allies were fighting the Axis powers and the Japanese, could have been shooting somebody down. So it sort of made sense. Okay, fine. Maybe my son's dream is about something that happened at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Don't know how this even happens. Don't know how this is possible, but I'm going to do some research. And so that's what Bruce does. He begins researching the Battle of Iwo Jima. Doesn't even really know what he's looking for, but he just wants to see if there's anything connected to what his son has been saying. And what he eventually discovers actually is sort of a relief. He discovers that there is no record of any Corsair airplanes crashing during the Battle of Iwo Jima. In fact, no Corsair planes at all were flown during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And his son James had been saying specifically, I flew a Corsair plane. That was the plane that crashed. And so he's thinking, okay, there's a hole in my son's story. He clearly must have latched on to some event somehow. Somebody said it to him, he heard it, whatever it is. And in his 2-year-old mind, he sort of warped it. And that's what he believes happened, but it's not real. He's not actually recalling something that happened in the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is just, a false memory or something. However, Bruce was unable to definitively find the names of pilots who actually flew in the Battle of Iwo Jima. He wanted to find if there was any pilots named James who potentially crashed, during that battle, but he just couldn't find the information. Maybe it existed somewhere, but he couldn't find it. And so Bruce had this idea to get in touch with this old veterans group. All these old guys who had served in the Battle of Iwo Jima that were still alive. They were based out in San Diego, and they got together periodically and just sort of had social hours and stuff like that. And Bruce, he goes out to San Diego, and under false pretenses, he basically tells the group that he's shooting a documentary about the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he needs some information, about certain pilots that flew during the battle. He goes out there, and he goes to one of their social events, and he begins asking around, asking if anybody knew about any pilots named James who were shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And basically all the men he talked to directed him to go talk to the group's historian, this one guy who kind of had all the information about what had happened during this battle. And so Bruce goes over to this guy and he starts asking him questions about, any pilots that, were shot down during the battle, do you know? And the historian, he tells Bruce that, during that battle, virtually no planes were shot down. However, there was one plane that was shot down. A single U.S. Air Force pilot was shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he was killed. And that pilot's name was James Houston Jr. Bruce couldn't help but be truly shocked that the only pilot shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima happened to be named James. That just seemed like a coincidence that couldn't be possible, considering what his son was saying. And so suddenly, Bruce doesn't know what to make of this information he's been given. For so long, his 2-year-old son, named James, has been talking about how in his dream he's been shot down by the Japanese military during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And now he's being told there was a single pilot shot down in real life during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name was James? How is that possible? That just seems impossible. And so at this point, Bruce is really holding on to the fact that his son had said his plane that he was shot down in was a Corsair plane. And this guy, James Houston Jr., who was shot down, the plane he was shot down in was not a Corsair plane. And so Bruce is telling himself, okay, this is just a crazy coincidence. This didn't somehow happen to my son. He's not channeling somebody else who died years ago. That can't be what's happening here. This is just a wild set of circumstances. That's all this is. But he's freaked out now. And so he calls his wife and he tells her about what he's learned, and he kind of downplays how much this has really unsettled him. But he ultimately tells his wife, and the two of them decide, okay, you know what? Let's just do a little bit more research and just figure out what's going on here. This is just so crazy. We got to do a little bit more research. And in doing research about James Houston Jr., they discover that James has a sister who is still alive. And so they decide to contact her. Not really even sure what they're going to say, but they figure, you know what, let's just get in touch with her and just tell her what's going on. Who knows? Maybe somehow she can explain this. Who knows? And so kind of on a whim, James and his wife, they send a message to this woman, to the sister. And the sister, when she finds out there's this 2-year-old who's sort of referencing her brother's death in some way, for whatever reason, her reaction was to send actual physical photographs of James Houston Jr. when he was a pilot, when he served in the military. She just sent a whole bunch of pictures to Bruce, his wife, and James to look at. There really wasn't a clear set of what do we do now, and so that's what she did. Here are some pictures. And when Bruce looked at these photos, it was like his whole world was completely rocked. Because in one of the photos that clearly showed James Houston Jr., he is standing in front of a plane, and that plane was a Corsair plane. And so at this point, for Bruce, it felt like the set of circumstances, the coincidences here, were simply too much to ignore. This is no longer coincidence. This is something else. And also, there's one other small detail that now was sort of bubbling up in Bruce's mind, and that was, periodically, his son James would talk about how he really wasn't named James. He was named James III. Just periodically, his son would say that. Not every time, but he brought it up enough that it was sort of a known thing, that he was James III. And now Bruce is thinking, James Houston Jr.? That's James II. My son? How could he possibly know all these things that happened to James Houston Jr. if he was not James III, James Houston Jr.'s reincarnated soul? Bruce would eventually take his son's story to the news, and the family would film a primetime segment on ABC about it. James was soon invited to the Battle of Iwo Jima Veterans Reunion, where he would shock the group with his knowledge of the battle. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, and when he did, he called her by a nickname that only her late brother ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit had come back to Earth in James III. If reincarnation is real, James's story is one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history. In the spring of 1986, a 22-year-old man named Will walked across the campus of the University of Missouri. Will was just a few months away from graduating from that university with a bachelor's degree in journalism. But recently, he was starting to feel like he actually didn't want to be a journalist after all. He didn't have any real passion for journalism. However, he did have passion for Hollywood movies. Will had lived in Missouri his whole life, and now he was, going to college in Missouri as well, so he was pretty sheltered, hadn't really gone anywhere. So for him, movies had sort of been like this magical portal into a different world. Hollywood would show him all these amazing places and people, and so that was his escape. He loved Hollywood movies. And so with Will's senior year coming to a close in just a few months with, real life right there on the horizon, Will sort of had this big revelation. that he simply didn't want to be a journalist. And in fact, what he was going to do is just drop out of college, literally weeks away from his degree, and move to California, to Hollywood, to actually pursue being an actor in Hollywood movies. But despite Will's incredible enthusiasm and naivete, when he got to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, he realized that he was not the only young person with this big dream. There were loads of aspiring actors and actresses who loved Hollywood and wanted to break in that were here, basically competing for all the same roles in all the same films. Now, this didn't deter Will. He wasn't totally shocked. Of course, people wanted to be big movie stars and come out here and try their hand. And so he went out and auditioned constantly. He didn't care what movie it was. He wanted to be in one, but he just was not getting the work. Nobody was picking him up. He was auditioning and being rejected over and over and over again. And Will was okay with that. He figured, okay, I'll get better and eventually get cast for something. But the problem was his finances. It was expensive to live in Los Angeles, and there really weren't all that many jobs available. During the day, Will really wanted to focus on just auditioning constantly, and so the only work he could reasonably take was sort of side gigs that he could work late at night or early in the morning. Except, again, there's so many people trying to do what Will is doing, aspiring actors and actresses, that basically all the side gigs in LA were sort of already taken. And so the only ones that were available to Will were like the bottom of the barrel side gigs, the ones nobody wanted. But, Will was determined and he was okay taking whatever was available. And so he ultimately got 2 jobs. He worked as a mascot for a fast food chicken restaurant where he basically would stand outside in a chicken suit and try to encourage people to go into the restaurant. And then at night, he would work as a limo driver, but for a very specific group of people. He was a limo driver for strippers who would go mostly to bachelor parties, and it was Will's job to drive them to and from these parties, and then also to go in with them and, sort of be the DJ, play some music for them. And then at the end of the night, he was in charge of picking up all the money and clothes that were kind of strewn about from the event, and packaging it all up, putting everybody and everything back in the limo, and driving him back home again. Now, at first, Will just sort of accepted that this was his life, because eventually it was not going to be his life. He was going to break into Hollywood, and he wouldn't have to wear the chicken suit or drive the strippers around anymore. He could just be an actor, and he could do the thing he really wanted to do. But pretty quickly, Will realized that the opportunity to break in just wasn't really happening. But what was really happening is he was spending a lot of his time being the chicken suit guy and driving strippers around, because he had to pay his bills and these jobs didn't pay very much. And so he had to kind of encroach on the daytime hours and work more hours during that time that he would like to be auditioning just to pay his bills. And then when he would audition, he just continued not to get cast. And so before long, it just sort of felt like he was working these 2 kind of awful jobs all the time, barely sleeping, so that he could just get rejected over and over and over again and not break into Hollywood? It was depressing. And ultimately, what he decided to do was, I'm going to quit one of my jobs. He decided he would quit the limo stripper job and just do the chicken suit job to buy a little bit more time during the day so he could audition a little bit more, and for a little while he would just put all of his effort into that and hopefully land a big spot. And if he didn't, well, then his big dream likely was not going to pan out and he'd have to move back home. But on Will's final shift as a stripper driver, one of the strippers actually said something to him that totally changed his life. He was driving him around on their way to bachelor parties, doing this and that. And at some point, Will struck up a conversation with this woman. She was a stripper, but during the day, she too was trying to become an actress. Stripping was her side gig to make enough money to live in LA to try to break into the industry. It wasn't going great for her, but, she was enthusiastic and committed the same way Will was. And over the course of this conversation, she told Will that, in addition to auditioning and, working when you had to, you should also take this particular acting class. There's this one great class that all the biggest and best aspiring actors and actresses are taking, and lots of very successful actors and actresses have taken. This is the one to get into. You really ought to divert some of your time during the day to going to this class. And for Will, he appreciated the input, but he's thinking that's not really going to help me. Right now, I don't need to learn how to act. That's going to take way too long. Like, I don't need that. I need action. I need to audition. I need to just be given a role, and then my training will be on the job. I'll learn by acting, not by training to act. However, he's also thinking to himself as he's driving around all night and she's talking about how great this class is, that he's like, you know what? At the same time though, my auditions have not gone well. Nothing's really going well. And so maybe I'll just go to this class once. I mean, she's going to be there. She wants me to go. I'll go with her. I'll go one time, maybe it'll be good for me. And so he agrees to go. And so not long after this final shift where he has this sort of pivotal interaction with the stripper, he goes to the acting class, and the stripper is there and she's so excited to see him, and he makes his way in and he sits down, and at some point during the class, the instructor says, okay, we're going to pair you up with other people in the class, and you're going to act out a scene in front of everybody else. And so Will, he randomly gets paired up with this other actor who in fact had a real audition that night. The scene they were going to act out was actually going to be done in front of actual agency reps who had come to this class. They were there literally to see this other actor do this particular scene. Will was just being asked to basically play support and allow this other actor to do their scene and hopefully get the part. And Will knows this. He's like going into this with, okay, I'm going to read these lines and you're going to kind of be the one really auditioning here. And it'll be in front of the whole class. It'll be, both cool to see a real audition and good exposure to the folks that are in the class. And so they do this scene, and Will, who really is just trying to play a good supporting person here, is so unbelievably talented. He's so into the scene. His emotions come through so beautifully that he completely overshadows the other actor. Like, he completely destroys them and comes out looking like the star that really he thought he was. And the agency reps were so blown away by it, they actually didn't cast the other actor who was supposed to be auditioning for this role. They basically said, no, we're not interested in you. We're going to cast Will in this role. Will basically stole the role from this other actor. And this moment would end up being so talked about and so iconic that this virtual nobody stole the show and landed this role, that people began talking about Will in Hollywood, and wouldn't you know it, it led to his big break. Will began getting cast left and right as the lead actor, the starring role in Hollywood hit after Hollywood hit. Today, Will is one of the most famous and celebrated movie stars to have ever lived. He's won everything from Academy Awards and Golden Globes to People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. Will is his first name, but he's better known by his middle name, Brad. Brad Pitt. In early April of 1945, a 15-year-old girl named Etta curled up on a pile of blankets inside the basement of her aunt's house in Velp, which is a small town in the Netherlands. Etta's stomach hurt so badly, and she felt weaker than she ever had in her whole life, and this was because she was quite literally on the brink of starving to death. Etta was 5'6" tall, but her weight had plummeted to just 88 pounds. She couldn't walk, she couldn't stand, and she could barely speak. She was probably within a couple of days of actually dying. And despite the fact that, her aunt and her mother were right down there with her in the basement, along with some other refugees that her family was housing in the basement with them, nobody had food to give her. And so as much as they wanted to help her, they couldn't. And on top of that, making this already terrible situation even worse, Etta, her family, and the refugees had literally been trapped down here in this basement, for months because it was way too dangerous to go outside. It's part of the reason they couldn't get food. Going outside was a death sentence in and of itself. Because World War II was raging right outside. Bombs are being dropped, people are being shot, explosions left and right. I mean, they're totally trapped. So the country where Etta lived, the Netherlands, had been under Nazi occupation for almost 5 years at this point. When the Nazis had first taken over, Etta had been this strong, very energetic girl with dreams of becoming a professional ballet dancer. She'd been so young when the occupation began that she hadn't fully understood what was even happening. But then, Etta's uncle, who was a prominent anti-Nazi activist, had been captured and executed by the Nazis. And this really spurred Edda into action. I mean, she saw how serious this really was, and she was not just going to stand idly by. And so she had spent several years working with an anti-Nazi group called the Dutch Resistance, doing things like, performing ballet at secret fundraising events to try to raise money for this anti-Nazi movement, and also smuggling resistance newspapers all over the country. She'd even convinced her family to take in refugees and hide them from the Nazis, even though she knew that if she and her family were caught, they would all be killed. And all of this had given Edda a real sense of purpose. She felt like she was actually doing something tangible to fight the Nazis. However, about 9 months earlier, the Nazis had cut off supply lines into the Netherlands, and since then, the entire country had been completely devastated. People had basically no food, they had zero access to medicine, running water, or electricity, and so Edda, like many other people in this country, had begun to starve. And she'd gotten so sick and so weak that as she was starving, she couldn't do any work with the resistance at all anymore. All she could do was literally just lie in this basement and effectively wait to die. And that particular day, as she listened to the sound of planes, gunshots, and sirens going off outside, Edda prayed to God for help. But the only response she got was a high-pitched whistling sound, then a deafening blast. The floor shook, glass shattered, and everything went black. Sometime later, we don't know exactly how long, probably days, Edda came to. And unbelievably, as she looked around, despite effectively her basement being the target of a bombing run, she looked around and saw the basement's structural integrity had effectively held up, and her loved ones and the refugees and she were all still alive. But, Edda, she was not like, oh great, everything's fine now. It was more like, okay, the Nazis are getting closer. And if they've bombed us just now, I'm bound to be bombed again, or I'm going to starve to death, like the end is right on top of us. But as she kind of looked around and continued to take stock of the situation, she realized something was very different. Over the last several weeks and months, the constant bombardment of bombs and guns and sirens and chaos outside was near constant. But right now, even though they've just recently been bombed and barely survived, like the Nazis must be right on top of us, despite that, she's listening and she can't hear anything outside. There's no explosions, no gunfire, nothing. It's quiet. Edda and her family were much more confused than anything else. But eventually, they worked up the courage and, with the help of her mother literally carrying Edda, the group of them, along with the refugees, walked out of the basement to see what was going on outside. And when they got up there, what they found were the streets were full of Allied soldiers. And they saw Dutch people crying and hugging, saying it was all over. And that's when Edda, her family, and the remaining refugees that were with them realized the Allied soldiers had liberated their city. For the first time in nearly 5 years, they were now free from Nazi occupation. If that bomb had struck more directly on their basement, or if the war had simply gone on for even just one more day, Edda could have very easily died in that basement. Instead, she survived. Sort of against all odds, she survived. Shortly after coming out of the basement, the Allied powers didn't just liberate that city where Edda lived. They fully eradicated the Nazis across Europe. The Allies won, and World War II finally ended. And Edda, who basically shouldn't be alive at this point, went on to have this unbelievable post-war life. Before the war, Edda had dreamed of becoming a professional ballet dancer. But during the war, she had suffered all these injuries and really had been affected by malnutrition, and it left her with long-term health problems that effectively made dancing full-time not a possibility. So instead, she began modeling and acting, and eventually she moved to Hollywood. And in 1953, so 8 years after nearly being blown up by the Nazis and starved to death by the Nazis, Edda starred in a movie called Roman Holiday. And she actually won an Academy Award for her performance, even though World War II had taken a lot from Edda and her family. I mean, it had nearly killed her, and it also took away her dream of being a ballet dancer. Despite that, experiencing the war so intimately like she had been forced to, it had instilled this incredible poise and discipline and a real quiet strength in her that would make her one of the most successful actresses of all time. Etta was actually just her nickname, and when she started making it big in Hollywood, she abandoned it and began going by her full name, Audrey Hepburn. One morning in the summer of 1889, a 36-year-old surgeon named William Halstead and his head nurse, 27-year-old Caroline Hampton, stood in an operating room prep area in the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Halstead was the surgeon-in-chief of this hospital, and that morning, he and Caroline were getting ready for a surgery. Now, Dr. Halstead had already washed up and was prepped, and now he was watching Caroline very closely to make sure she followed his hygiene requirements exactly. Caroline stood in front of a row of sinks that were all filled with different cleaning agents. She started by washing her hands with scalding hot water and medical-grade antibacterial soap. Then she cleaned her nails with brushes and files. Then she dipped her hands in acid. And then she finally finished with a 5-minute soak in a highly corrosive liquid called mercury bichloride. Dr. Halstead ran a really tight ship, specifically when it came to hand washing. And this was the process he believed was the safest. And Dr. Halstead's theory that basically nuking your hands with cleaning agents before doing anything in the medical field actually made him sort of unique at the time. Because this was 1889. And hand washing was just not very common, not even in hospitals. Germ theory, which is the idea that illnesses can spread by germs that we can't see, and they're all over us on our hands in particular, and so we have to kill the germs to prevent the spread of illness, right? That theory, germ theory, was very new at the time. And truthfully, a lot of doctors at the time didn't believe in germ theory, which meant they didn't do things which we would now consider standard hygiene practice in hospitals, like, basic hand washing and regularly disinfecting tools and surfaces. And Dr. Halstead was a huge proponent of germ theory and aggressive hand washing. And so he had instituted this whole multi-step awful hand washing routine for his whole surgical team at Johns Hopkins, and the results had actually been fantastic. He had one of the lowest surgical mortality rates in the whole country. But despite that, people still sort of thought Dr. Halstead was crazy, including his own staff who, complained about these highly corrosive cleaning materials that they were rubbing all over their hands all the time. Like even if this worked, this was kind of awful. But despite that, Dr. Halstead was not about to change his protocol. He knew it worked, even if it hurt. But that particular day, as Dr. Halstead and Caroline sat there letting their hands air dry after dipping them repeatedly in acid, he couldn't help but notice when he looked over at Caroline that her hands and her forearms looked really bad. Like they were blistered and just totally damaged from clearly doing this process all the time. And Dr. Halstead, he just sort of felt bad about it. And the reason he felt bad about it was sort of twofold. One, Caroline never complained, even though obviously every day when she would do this procedure that he is forcing on her, she was hurting herself in the process, but she never complained. And so that's actually why he had elevated her to head nurse, because he thought she had such grit and determination and she believed in the process, and so he had made her head nurse. But the other and more prominent reason why Dr. Halstead felt sort of bad about Caroline in particular and the condition of her hands and forearms was because Dr. Halstead was secretly totally infatuated with Caroline. Now, he had never told her that. This was something he kept completely inside because he, one, thought he was too old for her, and two, he just kind of assumed that she would never be interested in him. So he just carried this intense love of Caroline and was very protective of Caroline, but she didn't really know. And so that was why when he looked over and saw her clearly in pain but not complaining, that because of his love for her, Dr. Halstead really, for the first time, began to question his big hygiene process. He knew it worked, but at what cost? His beloved Caroline was suffering because of him. And worse, he was sort of trapped. He would love to tell her that she didn't have to do that. Let your skin heal. I'm so sorry, Caroline. But if he did that, if he made an exception for her and said, don't follow this process anymore, people would find out and it would totally undermine his credibility. His whole thing is he's like, everyone must follow this process to stop the spread of germs and stop the spread of illnesses. Everybody's got to do this. And so if he didn't make her, what does that say about him? And so as he's sitting there watching Caroline dutifully get ready for surgery, Dr. Halstead, for the first time, really began seriously considering if there was any way, any sort of workaround that maybe could lessen the pain for Caroline, just because he loved her. That was it. It wasn't a safety thing. It was just because he loved Caroline. But despite putting some real thought and energy into trying to come up with something to lessen the burden on Caroline, he just couldn't find a solution. All his solutions involved her not following the process, which he couldn't do. Fast forward to early 1890. So about a year after Dr. Halstead first really began considering how can he help Caroline not hurt her hands anymore. So about a year after that began to be a thing for him, and he's in his office and he's looking at his desk, and on his desk is this small package. And he hasn't opened it yet, but he's so excited. He's also kind of nervous, but he feels like this is it. This is the thing I've been waiting for. So over the past year, Dr. Halstead had continued to iterate on how can I help Caroline? How can I keep her from hurting herself? And eventually he had this huge epiphany. He came up with this sort of outside-the-box concept, and he pitched it to a company and said, hey, can you help me make these? And now, sitting in front of him on the desk was effectively the prototype of this strange thing he had come up with, which again was just to help his love, Caroline. And so, Dr. Halstead took a deep breath, he walked over, and he ripped open the package, and inside were these two strange-looking objects. And he picked them up, and without any hesitation, Dr. Halstead took the two objects, he left his office, hustled down the hallway to the OR prep room where he finds Caroline. And she's getting ready to wash her hands, for an upcoming surgery. And he stops her and says, here, and he hands her the two objects, and he says, don't wash your hands, just use these. And with a confused look, with her bloody and blistered hands, she took the two objects and said, okay. 1 week later, and already Caroline's hands and forearms were healing up beautifully. And also, Dr. Halstead, over the course of this week, was so excited about his prototype and the progress that he was clearly seeing in Caroline's skin condition that he finally worked up the nerve to tell Caroline how much he loved her. And Caroline would actually tell him that, believe it or not, I'm in love with you too. And before long, Dr. Halstead proposed to Caroline and they got married. However, it was not their love that sort of was remembered for generations to come. Instead, the only reason we know about these two is because of that prototype that Dr. Halstead came up with, what he gave to Caroline that ultimately saved her skin. It was the perfect workaround to his hygiene hand-washing process. In fact, these objects that he created were so effective that he and everybody else, basically in medicine across the world, began to use these brand new tools. And so it is almost entirely because of one man's love for a woman that we now have arguably the most used medical tool in the world. Dr. Halstead inadvertently created the world's first ever rubber surgical gloves. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.